huge thanks to Susan and Ian and Asagir and the interns for helping to make this possible, and just delighted to be here. I think that diplomacy is terribly important and undervalued. I believe that it is in trouble as a profession, and that if we are going to address the central problems of globalization, then we are going to have to find a way to bring diplomacy from the margins of international policy into the mainstream. My main argument in the book, and I'll give it to you right off the bat, is that if you believe that development is a large part of the new security in the age of globalization, then diplomacy must replace defense at the center of international policy. I believe that foreign ministries should be the central agencies for the management of international policy, and instead I see that that responsibility tends to be drifting towards defense departments, which I believe to be a strategic error. So just before the turn of the 20th century, Albert Einstein was teaching at Humboldt University in Berlin. And he failed in his advanced physics class, one of his students who had to take the course over again. And when it came to be exam time, and the questions were handed out, the student put up his hand and he said, Professor, I think there's been a terrible mistake, because this is the same question that was on last year's exam. And Professor Einstein looked at the student and he said, of course it's the same question. It's the answers that have changed. And I think there's a very important lesson in all of that for us when we think about diplomacy. It's not that diplomacy is any less relevant today than it ever has been before, but I think that it suffers from a very grave problem of image and also of substance. And I'm going to talk about both of those. I believe, however, that diplomacy really contains within its modus operandi the key to managing the threats and challenges of the 21st century. And it represents as well an antidote to the militarization of international policy, which it strikes me is continuing unabated pretty well universally. So to get from the margins into the mainstream, I think that diplomacy needs a new narrative. And I think if I've made a contribution towards equipping diplomacy with a new narrative, then that's the book. The way that the book is structured is the front end is the analytic part. It's the framing, the contextualization, the making the arguments that allow one to get to an up-close and rather detailed discussion of diplomacy, foreign services, and foreign ministries. Let me just take you very briefly through the arguments in order that we can get to how we might radically reconstruct our foreign ministries and foreign services and diplomatic business models to make them more relevant, more effective, and transformed. I think the first myth of international relations is that diplomacy is for wimps, that diplomacy is about weakness, that it's about appeasement, that it's about caving to power, that it doesn't work. I think this is reflected in the popular lexicon. Weasel words, talk is cheap, full and frank discussions, which is a synonymous with vacuity. I think that's wrong. I believe that diplomacy's never really recovered from that devastating image of Chamberlain in Munich announcing peace in our time. And we need to find a way around that, and I've got some ideas for getting around that. But the reason that diplomacy is not about weakness, appeasement, nor is it for any but the most brave-hearted rather than wimps, is that in the 21st century, it, in my view, affords us the only way of addressing the real threats and challenges to life on the planet as we know it, which have very little to do with political violence and religious extremism, which isn't to say I don't think those are important issues, they are, but they're really not in the Class A of threats and challenges. Class A of threats and challenges, which I'll talk a bit more about a bit later on, in my view, are almost entirely rooted in science, often very complex science, and driven by technology. And they include climate change, pandemic disease, public health, food security, resource scarcity, finding alternatives to the carbon economy, and so on. Let me say right off the bat, there are no military solutions to those problems. The military is not the right international policy instrument to treat those sorts of problems. It is both too sharp and, in my view, too dull an instrument to deal with these essential threats and challenges. Diplomacy, on the other hand, because it's all about knowledge-based problem solving, complex balancing, dialogue, negotiation, and compromise, it's often forgot that diplomacy, in fact, is an approach to the management of international relations. It's not something obscure or meaningless. It's actually a way in which we can broach these key questions and issues. That somehow has been lost in the mix. I think we've got to find a way to bring it back. So, is diplomacy for wimps? No. Diplomacy is for the brave-hearted, and moreover, is probably our best bet in managing the central challenges and issues of globalization. That's point one. Point two, security. What is it? Well, I think it's widely believed to be a martial art, and I don't think that security is a martial art. I think, in fact, that security has very little to do with generals and admirals and bombs and guns. Maybe it did during the Cold War. It certainly doesn't during the globalization age. I believe that security is intimately related to development, long-term, equitable, sustainable, human-centered development. Not really the sort of stuff that USAID or CETA or DANITA or any of the aid agencies do, but something really more profound and a lot deeper, having to do with a situation in which the human person can approach something like their potential without running into unreasonable obstacles and constraints. So it's economic development, but it's political development as well. So I don't think that security is a martial art. I think in large part it is the flip side of development, but rather than seeing out there in the world a lot of security and development, we tend to see the B-sides, insecurity and underdevelopment. And when insecurity and underdevelopment start rubbing up against each other, sparks tend to fly. When sparks tend to fly, governments get engaged, they get worried, it's a threat to stability, and what do? Well, what they've been doing is reaching for the gun. They tend to ram the military into those roiling interstices which separate insecurity and underdevelopment. And what I say is, let's just hold off for a while on sending in the Marines, because I think there's a better way. And I'd start with a couple of busloads full of my guerrilla diplomats, to whom I will come shortly. So, myth number one, diplomacy's for wimps. No, I don't think so. Myth number two, security is a martial art. If it ever was, it certainly isn't now. Myth number three, is the Cold War really over? Well, I suppose that historically it's really over. But it strikes me that a lot of the underlying intellectual and psychological constructs that allowed the Cold War to go on for 50 years haunt us still. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about a worldview which tends to see everything in terms of black and white, good and bad, very Manichaean, no grays, nothing very supple or subtle in there. I'm talking about a characterization of the threat as universal and undifferentiated. Back in the days of the Red Menace, The threat, of course, was global communism, and it was all the same. Cuba, China, North Korea, Angola, Mozambique. It was everywhere, and it was all the same. Rather the same way in which, under the global war on terror, or its many successor names, that threat is seen as universal and undifferentiated. We'll just throw them all in the same barrel. Hamas, Hezbollah, they both start with H out there in the Middle East somewhere. Doesn't really, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, I think they're the same. Not really anyway. They're all in there, just like all the commies were in there. So characterization of the threat as universal and undifferentiated. And the third aspect in which I think we could see some of these structures of the Cold War haunting us still is the way in which governments have responded. And they've tended to respond by militarizing international policy, mainly at the expense of diplomacy. And there's many rich and delicious ironies here, of course, not least being that Secretary of Defense Gates makes some of the most persuasive arguments in favor of re-resourcing diplomacy. And you've all heard about the marching bands and the lawyers in the Pentagon and how 1 year's increase in the Pentagon budget is greater than the total budget of the State Department, which includes all American official development assistance, and some really staggering figures, just in case anyone was wondering whether or not international policy had become militarized. Just look at the numbers. So I think that a good way of understanding the need to rethink international relations and diplomacy is by puncturing these three myths of international relations. That it's for wimps, that security is a martial art, it's not, and that the Cold War ended, and I would argue, in fact, it's just morphed into the long war in important respects. And that it's taking us to places that we'd rather not be. How then, turning to the second half of the book, do we get from looking to seeing, from hearing to listening, from diktat to dialogue? How do we turn the page? I propose a mantra: relevance, effectiveness, transformation. And under those key words, I would like to see a thorough reconstruction of the foreign ministry, making it more relevant. That's your State Department. The foreign service, I would turn it into an international service. And the diplomatic business model. One could speak for a very long time about how diplomacy is done. Let me just propose the idea of a diplomatic spectrum. If you can imagine diplomacy arrayed along an axis, with traditional state-to-state diplomacy at one end. This is diplomats talking to other diplomats about the business of government. There will always be a need for that. It's just that as states occupy an ever smaller space on the world stage, the scope for really addressing fundamental problems through traditional diplomacy is diminishing. In the center of this spectrum, I believe, is public diplomacy, which many people think is the new diplomacy. I expect everybody in the room knows what that's all about. It's about representatives of governments connecting directly with foreign populations to get them to want what you want through the power of attraction. This is Professor Nye's famous soft power. And once you've got them on board through joint ventures with civil society, partnerships with business, strategic use of the media, all sorts of ways, you let them work on their government to bring them on board. That works a whole lot better than going over to the foreign ministry at an appropriate level, making a démarche, leaving a diplomatic note, going back to the chancery, writing a report about it, and awaiting further instructions. That doesn't really get you to too many places in the 21st century. So public diplomacy, the new diplomacy, occupies, I think, the broad center of this diplomatic spectrum. And out on what I would characterize as the leading edge is this idea of guerrilla diplomacy, which my friend Bruce Gregory, who teaches here in Washington, some of you may know him, has described as public diplomacy on steroids. It's also been called extreme public diplomacy. It takes public diplomacy into places it's never been before, into conflict zones, into the barrio, into the favela, into the souk, and it practices diplomacy in ways that we don't usually associate with the world's second oldest profession. Faster ways, smarter ways, lighter ways, and more relentlessly innovative ways. So, the mantra, relevance for the foreign ministry, effectiveness for the diplomatic business model, and transformation. Speak a little bit about how we might transform our foreign services, given that AFSA are my partners and hosts today, and the fact that I did spend a lot of my time working for the Professional Association of Foreign Service Officers. I think the problem with diplomatic corps is that they've become boutique outfits, disconnected from the larger picture. How do we make them better connected? Well, part of it has to do with using public diplomacy domestically and creating some of those joint venture partnerships, not just with the like-minded, but with some strange bedfellows, and really trying to get networked and contacted at home the same way that we do when we're doing diplomacy abroad. It's a very, very funny thing how people seem to forget those skills when they get back to capitals. And it may well be that because diplomats are so accustomed to having their face to the world but their backs to their own countries, that they sometimes neglect to sustain those critical relationships and networks on the home front. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I think that foreign services have to start looking a lot more like the populations they serve. I haven't studied the U.S. Foreign Service, but I certainly have studied the Canadian Foreign Service, and I can tell you that there is a disconnect between the people representing Canada abroad and the people who live in Canada. Our population is much more diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multilingual than the people that we've got out there representing it, and that doesn't help your credibility on the home front. So, connect with diaspora communities, universities, really work on making the population of your foreign service more demographically representative of the population of your country. And thirdly, I would bring everybody that does international policy into the foreign service tent, and I would change the name from foreign service to international service. In Canada, we have huge international directorates in the Environment Ministry, in the Finance Ministry, even in Natural Resource Canada, Industry Canada. These people are doing international policy all the time. They have a lot of specialized expertise. They don't necessarily have the representational skills that you would expect to find in a diplomat, or the cross-cultural communication skills. But they're doing international policy work, and I would certainly bring them into the same organizational tent as the traditional foreign service and call it an international service. You double, triple, quadruple the size of your membership, and I think that that would increase your influence domestically as well. I talk in the book quite a bit about the importance of bringing our worldview. So that was the reform piece. I want to just before we get to the Q&A, because I don't want to drone on, and I'm very interested in hearing what you think about some of these ideas. We've got to find a better way to manage power shift and the accommodation of rising nations in the 21st century than we did in the 20th. During the 20th century, 2 world wars and a Cold War wasn't great. 21st century, what's going on? A lot of people are describing this emerging world order as multipolarity. I don't think that's quite right. Multipolarity is a term carried over from 19th century Europe, 18th century Europe, even balance of power thinking. Metternich, Castlereagh. Those were in the days when everybody thought that power came from the same sources. It was how big is your army, your navy, how large is your population or your economy? And hey, if what you're comparing is the same, you can add it all up, you can divide it, you can balance it, you can put it all down in a treaty, everybody can sign it, and that's the way they tried to balance power among and between the multiple poles. When power got out of balance, they either renegotiated the treaty or they had a war. The problem is that in the 21st century, those sources of power, it strikes me, are all different. In the US is going to be a major economic power, but no longer the world's largest economic power, not just within our lifetimes, but perhaps within the next decade, certainly not more than 2 decades. But it will, for the foreseeable future, remain the world's preeminent military power. So, there's a pole. The ever more integrated, if in fits and starts, European Union is emerging as some kind of a pole. Is it the world's cultural pole? Is it the artistic pole? Is it the soft power pole? Is it the social democracy pole? I'm not quite sure. Clearly, another major economic force like the US, but it won't be the biggest. The source of their power and influence is going to be something else. You've all read about China's peaceful rise. I won't go on about that, except I'll say stay tuned and watch that spot, because what's happening with China and India and Southeast Asia is incredibly important, as we can almost see power shifting across the Pacific in the 21st century in the same way as we watched it shift across the Atlantic in the 19th. So this isn't multi-pole, and Brazil is a pole, and Russia is a pole, and Indonesia may be a pole. There's a lot of poles, and their sources of power and influence are all different. They're not the same. You can't just add them up and make a treaty and have everybody sign, and you certainly don't want a war. So what do? Well, first of all, you give it a new name, and I've got to thank my friend James Derderian at Brown for coining this. He called it heteropolarity, and I've been trying to develop the concept. I think it's a good one, eh? Heteropolarity. I think it's quite good, and it suggests the very complicated underpinnings of the calculations. Well, who's going to be able to do the calculations, this kind of complex balancing that's going to be required? Because make no mistake, when these poles start bumping up against each other, sparks are again going to fly. We want to peacefully manage the emergence of these new powers and do better than we did in the last century. And who's going to be able to do it? Well, it's not going to be the generals and the admirals. I think it's going to be the diplomats. It's going to have to be the diplomats. If not the diplomats, then who? Complex balancing skills. Knowledge-based problem solving, experts at cross-cultural communication, dialogue, negotiation, compromise. If we can't make that work, folks, it strikes me that we're in much deeper trouble than we're already in. A little bit more on guerrilla diplomacy, the idea itself, and then let's go to Q&A. I describe the guerrilla diplomat, the diplomatic person, as being vested with the AAA qualities of acuity, agility, and autonomy. The acuity is the sharpness, the presence of mind, the intellect, the deep knowledge of place. It's that knowledge of place that gives foreign service officers, in my view, a competitive advantage over those from other government departments. It's our connection to the world. It's this intimate knowledge of place. So, acuity. The agility is the flexibility, the adaptability, the capacity to roll with the punches, to change and adapt with very rapidly evolving circumstances. This often means, folks, getting outside of the diplomatic bubble, which if you work in the Foreign Service, you'll know what I'm talking about. That means out of the chancery, it means out of the official vehicle, and in many cases it may well mean going outside the wire and actually mixing it up. The agile guerrilla diplomat is able to swim with comfort and ease in the sea of the people, to paraphrase Mao, rather than flop around like a fish out of water when he or she is outside the chancery walls. I can't tell you how many times I've been with my various head of mission bosses in situations where they are outside their comfort zone and they become visibly agitated. Where's my driver? Get me out of here. That won't cut it in the 21st century, because the front line of diplomacy, more often than not, is in precisely those sorts of places. We need people who not only can operate in those environments, but who like it there. What do I say about those kind of people? I say they are just as likely to have developed those sorts of skills by spending years out backpacking than semesters in the finest Ivy League universities, which isn't to denigrate the importance of formal knowledge acquisition. I do think it's important. But problem-solving skills, survival skills, life skills, cross-cultural communication skills, those you learn when you're out there on your own, traveling at the grassroots on a very limited budget, and I really think that there's some great parallels between backpackers and guerrilla diplomats. So that's acuity and agility. What about autonomy? Diplomats are often on a rather short leash. In the fast-breaking environments of the 20th century, high-risk, 21st century high-risk environments, they've got to be given a lot more room to maneuver if they're going to deliver results effectively. I believe that autonomy requires three things: confidence, trust, and respect. But it's got to work in two directions. You've got to have the confidence, trust, and respect of your bosses, but also of your interlocutors, the people that you're mixing with. Because if you don't have that, you will never be able to sink like penetrating oil down into the interstices of power and influence by negotiating pathways, navigating pathways which are unavailable to others. That's what your guerrilla diplomat, among other things, will be spending their time doing. A few examples of guerrilla diplomacy. I wish that I could give you more. I can give you a few. And one of the great things about guerrilla diplomacy is that it doesn't have to be practiced just by foreign service officers. For example, Canada's fisheries minister in the mid-90s, in response to a complaint by the Spaniards that Canada had committed an act of war by seizing a Spanish trawler called the Esti that had been overfishing and taking in undersized species off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. So we sent a submarine and two destroyers out, arrested the captain, and towed the thing into St. John's Harbor. The problem being that by the time we caught up with them, they were in international waters, which made it an act of war, which meant that actually our international legal position was bad. And Minister Tobin saw this, and he said, we're not going to win this one in world court, and that's where they want to take us, so what can we do? So he talked to his friend, the foreign minister, and he got all of the public affairs officers at the Canadian mission in New York to the UN and also at our consulate general, which altogether was quite a few in those days, got them to organize a big media event in the East River just behind UN headquarters, and he rented a barge. And 5 minutes before the Spanish foreign minister was about to address a fisheries conference under UN auspices and was going to lodge his complaint against Canada as step number one towards getting us into the dock at the World Court, Brian Tobin went out in this barge before the world's press that he'd rented, and he held up these undersized fish nets that he'd seized off this trawler, Esti, as all the public affairs officers went around handing out pictures of all the little tiny fishies, endangered species, undersized, really ringing every bell that they possibly could. And this made front page news. It resulted in their foreign minister at the time withdrawing an op-ed that was supposed to run, very bitterly critical op-ed, not in Canada's interest to have had run in the Wall Street Journal the next day. That was withdrawn. And as this Canadian campaign, and every public affairs officer in the world was getting instructions 24/7, who to call on, how to connect with the media, get civil society on board, talk to the NGOs. Week after that, Ross Frith, our then High Commissioner to the UK, UK fisher people were also very upset with the Spanish for similar reasons. He went down to Cornwall, almost as if by magic. As he arrived, Canadian flags went up every mast in Cornwall Harbour in a show of solidarity on the part of British fisher people. And that week, around the world, played these pictures of our rather staid High Commissioner standing amidst these Cornish fisher people in a sea of Canadian flags. And it was very, very powerful imagery. Moral of this story, a very innovative approach, showing how it is possible to win in the court of international public opinion some battles that you could never win in the world court. And might I add that when I gave that example at the College of Europe, where they are training, among others, many EU diplomats, a phalanx of Spanish lawyers were all over me, saying, well, Mr. Copeland, is what you're saying that you should be ignoring the rule of law and resorting to these tactics which undermine such an important principle as that? And I said, well, thanks for raising that. I'm really not trying to defend what the government of Canada did. I'm just trying to use it as an example of how powerful the use of certain diplomatic tactics can be when faced with some very serious issues and challenges. And it's really for others, other than practitioners, to decide whether this is good or bad or right or wrong. I'm just offering it as an example. Other guerrilla diplomats, I'd say Raoul Wallenberg, Budapest in the 40s, did not go back to Swedish authorities to ask if he could start issuing travel documents to Jewish children, hundreds of whom he saved. That, by the way, I haven't really spoken much about risk tolerance, but that's a really important element of guerrilla diplomacy and has to do with that confidence, trust, and respect that I spoke of. Ken Taylor in Tehran in '79, when he helped spirit the staff of your mission out of the country after the takeover by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. That was certainly had a major element of guerrilla diplomacy to it. Another Canadian diplomat named Mark Dolgan did something like that back in 1973 during the coup against Allende. 3 cabinet ministers turned up on his door and he sheltered them and helped get them out of the country. That one was not publicized at the time, but he didn't have time to go back to headquarters when they turned up in his door, ask if it's okay to take these people into his house. Sergio Vieira de Mello, Brazilian diplomat who was killed in 2003 when a truck bomb took out the UN headquarters in Baghdad. He was a guy who I would say would qualify as a guerrilla diplomat by virtue of his courage, determination, and commitment to make things happen at times and in places where others didn't believe that progress was possible. I'm talking about Timor, Cambodia, organizing elections, getting people to stop shooting, getting emergency humanitarian relief delivered. I think he was an example of a guerrilla diplomat. I wish I could give you more examples. I don't think there are. In closing, let me just say that if we are going to succeed in rehabilitating diplomacy, which strikes me as a very worthwhile goal, in bringing it from the very esoteric place that it is right now into the mainstream of international policy, I believe that the transformation of the Foreign Service, the refitting of the diplomatic business model to make it more effective, and really tuning up the relevance of the foreign ministry by turning it into an entrepot for the management of the globalization process is absolutely critical. We've got to end the militarization of international policy. You cannot call in an airstrike on global warming. You can't garrison against pandemic disease, and you can't send out an expeditionary force to occupy the alternatives to the carbon economy. only diplomacy is going to get us to where we need to be in the 21st century. And I hope that I've convinced at least some of you to support the achievement of that objective. Very happy to take any questions, and you can always get me through the website. I answer all my emails. Daryl.Copeland@GuerrillaDiplomacy.com. And happy to engage any of you in follow-up discussion